He's the assistant director, and he's in charge of shellfish sanitation. He's going to talk to us about those things, particular for conditions for growing offshore in federal waters. So if you're in the state, we'll talk about that kind of stuff that you might not even be aware of. But, and then question and answer. So I think we'll probably have a lot of questions from you.
So I don't have a PowerPoint. I think that this doesn't really lend itself well to a PowerPoint kind of a presentation anyway. It's just a lot of verbiage. You've been engaged today in things like siting and permitting and how you get into aquaculture and where you get into aquaculture. And what we're going to be talking about here this afternoon is what you do with the product after you grow it and are ready to sell it, send it to market. Particularly if it's molluscan shellfish. So let me start off by saying that this whole federal waters aquaculture thing, in a word, is kind of a mess in terms of things like permitting, who has the authority, how the agencies, the federal agencies, interact with one another on this, and how the federal agencies also interact with the state and the state agencies. Because in the end, okay, and particularly in the case of molluscan shellfish, that shellfish is going to be landed in some state, and when it gets there, it becomes the state's problem. Okay, and so the state has to deal with it. And it has to deal with it under the provisions of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, which deals with things like classification of growing areas, sanitation of the shellfish, how it's handled, how it's transported, how it's identified, and all of those sorts of things. Now, right up through October of 2017, the way federal waters were treated by FDA was based on a paper that was published in 1977 that basically said, in a nutshell, if FDA didn't close federal waters for some reason, such as microbiological contamination, chemical contamination, or biotoxins, it was open. What FDA chose to do back at the ISSC, and the ISSC is the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, but the ISSC is all of the state agencies that are involved in the public health side of shellfish, classification, handling of shellfish, and the federal agencies, so that's FDA, CDC, NOAA, EPA, are all represented in the ISSC, or members of the ISSC. This group is a voluntary group, and it also has industry members, and industry is a big participant in this organization. And what they do is they look at the provisions of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. These are the rules and regulations governing the handling of shellfish in interstate commerce, and decide where they need to be tweaked, what needs to be changed, what needs to be added, depending upon what's going on in the industry, and as new information comes out about public health, about emerging sanitation issues, or emerging biotoxin issues, those sorts of things. And every 2 years, then the model ordinance, which is really the provisions of the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, are then published, and upon publication, they're in effect. So, going back to the ISSC biannual meeting in October of 2017, FDA came in with 4 new proposals to change, the model ordinance. one of the proposals gave FDA responsibility to classify federal waters under the provisions of the NSSP. So what in fact that meant was that FDA, who for years said, unless we close it, it's open, is now saying we are going to classify federal waters the same way the states do. Which means doing sanitary surveys, doing water quality monitoring, doing enforcement patrol, which they wouldn't be doing because they're not that kind of an agency. So they made some arrangement with NOAA as to how they were going to do that, but nobody knows yet exactly how that's going to work. And so do everything that the states are doing, biotoxin monitoring, okay? They also then changed some of the provisions about aquaculture. And so that was the second proposal, or the second of the four proposals. And what they said there is that we're gonna have all these requirements on aquaculture in federal waters that are similar to the new chapter on aquaculture that was passed 2 years previous on aquaculture in state waters. And so things like operational plans, inspection, all these sorts of things that the states required in state waters for aquaculture, the federal government was now going to require in federal waters. And again, they were going to work out how this was actually going to get done by working with, again, NOAA, and some sort of an arrangement with NOAA, and also trying to get the states to participate in this. The problem is this becomes an unfunded mandate, for the states. States got a hard enough time doing what they're required to do under the NSSP in state waters, let alone, taking on, federal waters. What they also did is then they went in with a third proposal and changed the requirements for biotoxin monitoring in federal waters. Now, keep in mind the fact that prior to 2017, there was some language in the NSSP that talked about biotoxin monitoring, but when you really get down to the nitty-gritty of it, what they were talking about was paralytic shellfish poisoning, and it was red tide, it was saxitoxin, it wasn't domoic acid and ASP, it wasn't diuretic shellfish poisoning, or a whole host of other toxins that are out there that are found in more southern waters that, with climate change and global warming and all that, could be headed this way at some point in the future. What this proposal did was change that. Now, they did this talking about aquaculture, and the driving force there was Catalina Sea Ranch off the coast of California. California was going to have no part of regulating anything in their offshore waters. NOAA's pushing aquaculture in federal waters. FDA is concerned about biotoxins in federal waters. So this was a way to sort of solve that problem. It's one of those deals where on paper it looked great. From a practical side, it was a disaster. Okay, but because of the confusion of the conference dealing at all at once with 4 proposals dealing with federal waters, one of them primarily biotoxins, the other one primarily aquaculture. The conference, I think, made a huge mistake in adopting a couple of these proposals and didn't come to the realization of what they had done until probably 3 or 4 months after the conference, when people started to look at it and say, "Oh my God, what did we do here? What happened? How are we going to fix this?" So the fourth proposal then was one that laid out in extreme detail the requirement for management plans, not only in state waters. Okay, it's had to deal with how you're actually going to deal with biotoxins, all of the biotoxins. So in the case of like the New England states, that would be red tide, sex toxin, it would be domoic acid, pseudonychia, and it would be diuretic shellfish poisoning. How you're actually going to deal with monitoring and ensuring public health. The contingency plans were then another set of plans that were basically laying out how you're going to deal with all these other emerging toxins that were coming along that might show up on your doorstep someday, and the day they arrive, how you're going to deal with it. So that's it in a nutshell there. And then they laid out a guidance document that in extreme detail said, okay, this is how you're going to do this. At a minimum, you have to do the whole list of things. And so, interestingly enough, while all this was going on, everybody's talking aquaculture here, okay? Everybody's talking about just, what's going on the aquaculture scene. In fact, the way the language was written, it affects all shellfish from all federal waters all of the time, whether it's wild caught or whether it's aquaculture. So this had a huge impact, for example, on the surf clam industry in federal waters, the ocean cohog industry, and mussels coming out of federal waters, and anybody that's landing scallops other than scallops in the adductor mussel. So whole scallops, row-on scallops, or scallop with any part attached to it, other than the adductor mussel, is all under the National Shellfish Sanitation Program. Ugh, this is, we just shot ourselves in the foot here twice, okay? So people started to get really concerned. Surf clam industry got really, really concerned because what the FDA did is they took a protocol that was adopted 10 years ago by the ISSC for fishing in closed federal waters that allowed boats to go out on Georges Bank and do pre-harvest testing, screening, to make a decision as to whether they could fish or not fish. And then once they landed the product, keep it segregated, do a lot of testing before they could release the product into commerce. Give you an idea, there's one company that's been doing this for 9 years, and in the 9 years that they've been doing this, they have spent over $1 million on testing alone. And in 9 years, they got one positive hit. Think about that for a second. Okay? It's also created a situation where it's very prohibitive for anybody to get into the surf clam industry, because unless you're some big corporation that's got a lot of money, all right, you can't do this. Also keep in mind that this protocol was developed for fishing in closed waters. What the FDA proposal did was said, this is what you're going to have to do all the time in all federal waters, whether they're open or closed. Wait a minute. What are you doing? And we're going to apply it the same for aquaculture as we have for wild fisheries. So wild fisheries, I think, are harder to deal with. It's mobile gear, they're moving around, they're in different places, and the protocol was designed, to do that sort of a thing. Aquaculture stationary, fixed site. You got to grow growing something, same location, two very close locations, and you're not, you can monitor that, much more easily than you could, say, a situation involving, mobile gear. And so, therein lies the rub. You're going to, and again, Catalina Sea Ranch have taken everybody to court on this, is basically saying, you're requiring us to do all this, pre-harvest testing. and then all this post-harvest testing. And we're in a fixed location, and we're harvesting once a week or every other day. There's got to be some better way of dealing with this, and as far as I'm concerned, there is. You have basically what I would characterize as a risk-based way of approaching this. It's just very similar to the way we do it in Massachusetts, the way Maine does it. Every state has their own state waters biotoxin monitoring program. I've been doing biotoxin monitoring since 1972 in Massachusetts. In fact, we started here in Cat Cove. It's based on stations, sentinel stations using a sentinel species, the blue mussel. Blue mussel's good because it picks up the toxin real quick. It gets rid of the toxin real quick, so it's sort of giving you a good indicator of toxin accumulation and uptake and depuration in real time. We've figured out over the years, when we first started, we had 38 or 9 stations along the coast. We've got that down now to 16 stations because over the years we've been able to look at the data, and certain stations start picking up the toxin all the time before everybody else. And then we have secondary stations and tertiary stations. So if you start picking up toxin at a primary station, you can start kicking in some of the secondary stations around it and go to different species, and then you can go out to the tertiary stations and you can close by species and by years. It's a nice system if you stay on top of it. And this is what we're suggesting be done for aquaculture. The problem is this was adopted in October of 2017. It went into effect upon publication, which was October of 2018. Okay? And so it is in full force and effect. Now, that means everybody that's landing shellfish out of federal waters right now is out of compliance. Okay, so take that one home. And if the federal government wanted to do something, they could just shut everybody down. This afternoon, 3 o'clock. Let's shut everybody down. You're out of compliance. ISSC was able to prevail upon FDA that we need to do something here. Number one, the federal agencies aren't ready to do what they said they wanted to do. They haven't figured out how they're going to do some of it. That's all it's worse yet. Okay. What FDA is saying is that any area that has a history of biotoxin, either high toxin levels in shellfish, has had any closures because of biotoxins, or has had HAB blooms that have had high levels of algae that produce biotoxin, is going to be an area that's going to require the use of the protocol. Okay, so what they said they were going to do is they were going to produce maps saying which areas were high hazard areas and which areas aren't high hazard areas, and how they're going to deal with them. Well, for all intents and purposes, everything from the Canadian border, down off of Long Island is going to be a high hazard area. It's an area that has had a whole history of closures. I have a list of about 8 pages of closures going back to 1989 that have occurred in the waters off of Massachusetts and out on Georges Bank. So, we're in a high hazard area. So right now, even maps or no maps, we don't need the maps. Just throw a map up there with the Gulf of Maine, that's it. You're in trouble. So, ISSC had a 2-day conference last October in College Park, Maryland. with FDA and with NOAA to talk about this and said, you guys need to get your act together here. And you guys need to slow down on implementation of this. We asked them, just don't implement it. They chose to say, well, it's on the books. We're going to implement it, but we're not going to really enforce it at this point. It's a semantic scheme. Their lawyers talking to somebody else's lawyers, but that's what that was. And they didn't want to be the authority. That was the other thing, because they were afraid that if they were the authority in federal waters, then somebody was going to have to evaluate them. And who would that be? God, I guess, because they weren't going to let the states do it. They evaluate the states. They evaluate the states. So, I mean, they sort of painted themselves in a box here. I'm probably being kind at this point. At any rate, ISSC has a standing biotoxin committee, and usually anything to do with biotoxins, ISSC sends it to this committee, and it's got people there that really know what they're doing in the biotoxin world, people that run state biotoxin programs, people from NOAA, people from FDA that actually do research on biotoxins. They're not policy people, they're scientists. Originally this was going to go to the biotoxin committee, but the biotoxins committee's got all sorts of things related to biotoxins going on in other states, Alaska, Florida, out on the West Coast, different issues than the aquaculture issue. So what ISSC said, well, really what we're talking about here is aquaculture, and so let's have a federal waters aquaculture committee. Well, that lasted about a month, because what everybody figured out was this is bigger than aquaculture. This is wild fisheries, and so it's all about classification of federal waters, okay, which is a lot of things besides biotoxins, and things like enforcement, and things like certifications, things like traceability, all of the components of the NSSP that the states have to deal with. And so it became the Federal Waters Classification Committee, and then they created a subcommittee to deal just with the biotoxin part of it. I'm on both of those committees, so I have some idea what I'm talking about here. So those committees have been meeting. We're in the process of writing a proposal for the conference. The next biannual meeting is going to be in October of 2019 in San Diego. We have to get this submitted by the 1st of June, so we got a short time left here to finish this up, but it's a good group working on it to try to fix this and to fix the biotoxin part of it, and hopefully get FDA on board. FDA has finally at the and I'm going to read something to you, and I can pass a copy of this out to everybody, but this is just an excerpt, and pardon me I'm just going to read it verbatim. This was a statement that the FDA gave on April 18th at the ISSC board meeting. And it talks about Proposal 17-119, which was the proposal that created this fiasco. And so it says Proposal 17-119, Marine Biotoxin Control in Federal Waters, was submitted by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration to the Interstate Shellfish Sanitation Conference in 2017, redefining the marine biotoxin control strategy for harvesting of mollusk and shellfish in federal waters where toxin-producing phytoplankton are known to occur and the toxins are prone to accumulate in shellfish. Like I said, that's everywhere off the New England coast. The proposal was adopted at the 2017 biennial meeting and became effective upon publication of the NSSP Guide for the Control of Mollusk and Shellfish 2017 revision, released on October 17, 2018. While the marine biotoxin controls adopted in Proposal 17-119 are already in effect, The FDA recognizes the need to work with the industry, NOAA, the state shellfish control authorities to facilitate compliance. Nice of them to do that. The FDA met with NOAA and the ISSC Federal Waters Subcommittee in October, and this is the October meeting that I talked about in College Park, to discuss the type of controls that would be necessary to implement the new requirements. The subcommittee meeting participants developed a list of issues that must be addressed prior to implementation. FDA's got that list. The FDA will be working with NOAA and the ISSC to address these issues. The FDA recognizes that implementation for stationary aquaculture facilities and wild harvest in federal waters will be different. Thank God on that one. Okay. We anticipate providing oversight, and we being, this is FDA, this is an FDA statement. We anticipate providing oversight for stationary aquaculture facilities will be more manageable for the FDA and NOAA. Providing oversight for wild harvest will require a more complex strategy for permitting, designating harvest restrictions, and patrol. There are several ongoing activities that are critical to implementation. The FDA has developed a summary of requirements that must be met to ensure and determine the federal waters where toxin-producing phytoplankton are known to occur and the toxins are prone to accumulate in shellfish. And the summary includes one, the development of criteria to explain how FDA will determine the federal waters that are going to be affected. Two, an agreement or memorandum of understanding between the authority and the harvester or harvest. And this one here, this one gets a little complicated because there's two ways the federal government can do this. What the federal government would like to do is do an MOU with the states and then have the states oversee this, which would make the states then dealing directly with federally permitted activities with regard to the landing of the shellfish product. And so the state would then have an MOU with each and every single harvester or with each and every single wholesale dealer that's buying from a harvester. The states, all of the states in the Northeast, Maine down all the way through New Jersey, has said, no way, this is not going to happen. Okay, so if the states participate or choose to participate, this is what the state's taking on. If the state chooses not to participate, which is what the states right now are saying they're going to do, they're not going to participate, that means FDA and NOAA have to do this with each and every harvester and each and every wholesale dealer. And they have to figure out how they're going to enforce it, because we're not. Okay, so an impasse. And then who's going to pay for all this? FDA is saying, well, the industry's going to have to pay for this. And the industry is saying, wait a second, you're imposing this. There's got to be some cost sharing here. There's got to be, it's going to put this all on the industry. So this is, you can see where I'm going with this. This thing just gets, it's like going down a rat hole, and it just gets worse and worse as you go. Naturally, if you're going to be doing anything in federal waters, you need to have a harvest permit. That's no problem. There has to be vessel monitoring. There has to be biotoxin screening and training. There has to be lot holding and separation. It's going to require using laboratories that conform to the NSSB for dockside biotoxin testing. That's another one. There's only one lab in New England, private lab, that does that. Okay. Well, actually, there's two, but you can't afford the other one. That's Bigelow up in Maine. So forget that. You'll be out of business the second day. So you got one lab that's going to do that. And by the way, the people that are running that lab have already told me that they're probably going to close the lab down and go into something else. So, and I'm not making that up. I mean, that's a fact. That's a conversation that occurred 3 days ago. last week. Yeah. So you got this whole lab problem because the states aren't going to do it. If the states have to do it, then they have to do it fee for service, and there's all sorts of legal complications there. A state can't, like my agency, can't just decide we're going to do this and charge you for it. We have to get permission, from the legislature to do that. And then, how are the federal agencies going to provide oversight for landings in states without state agency involvement? So that's the biggie, all right? So the FDA plans to share this with the Federal Waters Subcommittee as soon as possible. I understand that that document is on its way over either today or tomorrow, and develop a strategy for notification of harvesters involved in the harvest of mollusk and shellfish in federal waters. So I know none of you like the message. Don't shoot the messenger. But that's where we are. Now, ISSC is on this. I'm not saying our fix will be perfect. It will be a whole lot better than what we're looking at. And so, having said that, we've already said things to FDA, like in the case of the Salem State Mussel Farm. They're just off our coast in federal waters. They're actually in a good location that we can use them as a sentinel station. We want to use them as a sentinel station. If we collect a sample out there once a week, like we do at all of our other sentinel stations, and if we start seeing toxin, then we, increase the number and frequency of the testing, just like we do at all of our other primary stations. That's good information from us, because right now we're using Star Island off of Maine, data we get from New Hampshire. So the mussel farm would be a lot closer. There's a lot of reasons why this would work for the state of Massachusetts. It would work. It makes sense. It's a risk-based type of thing, not this, we're going to test the bejesus out of everything from day one, every time we go out there to harvest, okay? And then do follow-up, testing afterwards. With that, I'll entertain any questions you might have. I could go on and on. I don't want to bore you to death. I think I've said plenty.
You said the open ocean surf clamber spent $1 million of testing for one hit.
Yep.
I know the hits are a lot more frequent inshore, unless they're opening and closing them. Just, is the biotoxin levels lower in the open ocean than
It
they are in
depends.
bays and harbors?
For years, George's Bank was under constant blooms out there. In fact, some of the blooms that were coming in through southern Maine and western Maine and Massachusetts were coming in off of George's Bank. Okay, and we know that for a fact. But that's a dynamic that changes. Okay, so the original closures out there in 1989 had to do with these massive Alexandrian blooms that were going on, were producing unheard of levels of saxitoxin in shellfish. Okay, and so George's Bank got shut down, and periodically they go out there and test it. The problem with that is unless you're doing some amount of sophisticated testing in a good time series, you don't really know what's going on. Surf clamps have a tendency to hold toxin, retain. They don't get rid of the toxin like mussels do. Okay, different animals, different metabolism. Plus, they shift the toxin around. You can actually start looking at surf clam tissues, and depending upon which tissues you're finding the toxin in, you can tell how long they've had the toxin, because it migrates through. Yeah, the tissues. Right. So each shellfish species is different. So the thing was, they closed George's Bank and walked away from it and said, it's closed, for surf clams and ocean collapses. Nobody can deal with this. The dockside protocol was put together it was tried
That's
out.
what reopened it, was allowed, if they did.
It
the
never
self-testing.
reopened, it's still closed. But you can only fish out there if you do it under the protocol. And to do it under the protocol, you have to have an MOU with the state where the product is being landed. So in this case, the company had an MOU with Massachusetts Division of Marine Fisheries, Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and FDA had to sign off on it. So that was that. But again, over $1 million in 9 years to the thing was overcome, right? And we kept saying, look, you know, we got to ratchet this back. I mean, if there's a problem, fine, and it's solving a problem, fine. But if there's no problem and we're making some lab fat and happy, that's not what this is about either. So that's what happened.
It's also per harvest, right? So you harvest that
Every
vessel.
vessel, every harvest. I mean, the other thing that we proposed was things like, okay, you get 3 vessels out there, efficient side by side. Do we have to have all 3 vessels doing all of this all of the time? You know, why can't you have 1 vessel doing it as long as it's staying within oh no.
So it's the same protocol for the guys doing the shell stocking of sea skulls?
Well,
Is
it
that how
will
they're doing
be
it?
if
Same
you're
protocol?
landing anything other than the adductor mussel. The adductor mussel is exempt.
Right, I
Adductor-
understand, the ducted mussels generally clean, but they'll have to fall under that same protocol at this
Exactly.
time. They'll have to, every load they bring in with the death rate, the short shelf life, if you're waiting 3 days for a lab, you don't have a live product.
So what this company was doing is keeping the product segregated. They were processing it because it was either going to be canned or frozen, and then holding it until they got the lab results, and then you could release it. That type of product, you can do that with. You know, you're not going to be able to do that. You know, mussels is going to be a different story. Scallops are going to be a different story.
Is there any shell stocking? Are they doing any whole roll-on scallops?
Well, if there are people that are doing it, there are people that are landing.
They have a memorandum and they're doing the testing, is that?
Oh, no.
Are they just doing it?
They're just doing it.
Okay, no, I understand that they said we're gonna make it a rule, but we're not gonna enforce the rule.
Yeah.
So basically, that's what's happening, they're just flying under the wire, something goes wrong and shit's gonna hit the fan. Okay, no, we're just trying to get straight on.
Don't call NEC on going home. Any other questions?
Have there been any discussions about using like satellite or in situ chlorophyll measurements to track whether they should be testing or not at certain times? Like if there's a high biomass of chlorophyll, you can say, okay, you should definitely test now.
Yeah, there's Woods Hole's working on that, Bigelow's working on it, Nola's working on it. I'm guessing NASA is probably also involved. And then, you know, this, the other thing that they're looking at is these robotic vessels that are out there just, you know, running a course and giving you, you know, not only instant plankton counts and environmental information, but also are actually, you know, testing the toxin. The other problem though is this, and you know, this is where, you know, I have to keep reminding people of this all the time. Just because you've got a big bloom going on, okay, and just because the bloom is producing toxin doesn't always mean that the shellfish are toxic. So in a recent Maine case, Pseudonychia, okay, first off, it's hard to tell even under a microscope whether you're looking at toxic pseudonychia or not. Okay. Secondly, up in Maine, when they were getting low levels of pseudonychia, you know, things, you know, counts in the 2, 3, 4,000 cells per liter, they were getting off the wall oxalic acid in the shellfish. All right,
Yeah.
So, what that really comes down to is how toxic were those algae compared to other,
Mm-hmm.
similar algae. What's the residence time over the shellfish? Where are the shellfish at depth in relation to the phytoplankton?
Mm-hmm.
We were looking at counts in Rhode Island and Massachusetts, on the south side of Massachusetts, that were up over 130,000 cells per liter of pseudonichia. We did closures based on that because we sort of hit the panic button on that one, especially after getting the information from Maine that I just told you about. And then when we started testing the shellfish, we were barely getting a hit, the lowest level of detection. Okay, and so if you're testing the algae, which is what Rhode Island is doing, I said, well, okay, and Maine did this for me. We'll test the algae. Oh, the algae is producing toxin. Yeah, so what? They're not eating the algae. What you're concerned about here is the toxin levels in the shellfish. And so, in the end, you're still going to wind up testing the shellfish. So, yeah, there's a lot of people looking at all sorts of innovative ways, to try to deal with this.
Yeah.
I just reviewed something like 5 different proposals. Looking at different ways of dealing with this.
2 more complicated factors. Sometimes the algae won't produce any toxin at all. We've had pseudonichia for decades, and sometimes it doesn't produce a toxin.
Yeah.
Oysters won't eat pseudonichia. They've never found a hot oyster, but the mussels will. And of course, if it's below 50 degrees, clams and oysters aren't feeding, so they're not going to pick it up. But the mussels will, and most states will close based on mussels.
Well, the other problem here is this. Everybody has been dealing with PSP for years, and the way shellfish take up the toxin for PSP is pretty well understood, species by species. What we're finding out is, in the case of pseudonichia, it's not the same. The uptake dynamics are totally different, and the declaration dynamics are totally different. And clams will take up oxalic acid quicker than mussels. Okay. Whereas with PSP, you're using mussels as the sentinel species because it takes up the toxin quicker than any other species. That's not the case with pseudonichia. And so these are the lessons that are being learned here. That just because it's biotoxin, from some HAB, doesn't mean that they work the same. They don't. It's complicated. Yeah.
So, Mike, I know Catalina Sea Ranch on the West Coast has been, a roller coaster ride, them trying to figure this out. But I do know that they have recently been harvesting and commercially selling. But how did they get to that point?
What they're doing right now is they're using the protocol. They are using the protocol. The other problem that I didn't touch on here, I didn't want to further complicate this, but this goes to your question. The Abraxas test, which is the test that was being used out at sea on George's Bank, worked very, very well as a pre-screening test. But what they found is in a land-based lab on bench, it wasn't working. Nobody could figure out why. And so then that put into question this 9 years worth of data from George's Bank that was all based on Abraxas, based on all the pre-screening work that they did. Because saying, well, Catalina Sea Ranch is using this and it's not working. And even Abraxas got involved in it, and FDA got involved in it, and it wasn't working, right? And they were doing all sorts of things to tweak the test, and it wasn't working. Yet they took the same test kits, and they went out on the George's Bank on the boats, and they were working fine. They actually set up a lab on the boat so that they could run, the more traditional tests like they would on a land-based lab against the Abraxas. what are we in, Twilight Zone here?
Yeah.
Turns out that the components in the practice test have to be steel. It reminds me of that Norwegian, put it on a ship and they send it out to sea for doing a rockabye baby. It keeps the components mixed. Okay, you let them sit on a shelf, stuff starts to settle out, and it doesn't work. So now they're taking the Abraxas test and they're putting it on a shaker, and it worked. That's a some reason or other. It needs to be agitated.
So is this the test that takes pictures of algae cell communities?
No.
And
No,
That's the,
just pictures?
no, this is testing, for toxin.
Okay.
Yeah.
So they were developing something else that actually imaged the algae cells.
Flow cytometers.
Yeah, there's flow cytometers, there's a number of those.
Yeah.
So they count the algae cells, but
They count the cells and
the cell
multiply.
counts aren't really indicative of the toxicity,
Yeah.
especially with pseudomonas.
Anything else?